Going to go ahead and get started. My name is Margaret Henn. I'm the Director of Program Management here at MBLS. And today we are going to talk about how to make your law firm more accessible. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get our slideshow started. So actually, this topic, we have been doing a lot of work internally at MVLS about how to make our organization more accessible. Being that we are a small-ish nonprofit, we don't necessarily have a large budget or resources for doing so, but so we are probably in the same boat as many of your organizations, in that we knew that this is something that would be important to our clients and to us as an organization, but we don't necessarily have a large budget for doing so. And so today I'm going to talk about what you can do, steps that we, based on, our experiences, steps that you might be able to do to make your law firm more accessible. By no means do I think that this is just an issue for nonprofits or for legal services clients, as we will kind of go through in these slides, in every different type of income demographic. There is a significant portion of the adult population that identifies as having some type of disability. And so, this is by no means just something that's relevant to your MVLS clients. I think in addition to making your practice more accessible for them, you are also going to be making your practice more accessible for your other clients as well. And I certainly think that this is something that could result in firms, getting referrals if clients feel comfortable and they're comfortable referring their friends to you as well who may be in this situation. So with that, we're going to kind of kick things off. We're going to talk about just, what is a disability? So there is an ADA definition of disability, and there is a slightly different definition in the state of Maryland. This is more of a soft skills training, I guess, than a legal training. We're not talking about disability claims or the legal definition of disability per se, but I thought it was helpful to start off with this slide so that you could see what we're talking about. I apologize as we're going through this. I think it's going to be easier for people to look at if we're just looking at the PowerPoint and not my entire screen. I think it's kind of busy. So give me 1 second. I'm going to try to do this again and just show you the PowerPoint. 1 second. Apologies for the slight delay here. Okay, let me see here. Sorry about that. I thought I had it all set up for everyone, and then I somehow managed to not be sharing exactly what I was trying to share. All right, I think this is better. Here we go. All right, so definition of disability. Physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of your major life activities. And I'm not going to read the entire definition, but this can be either physical or mental. I think that is one of the key things to keep in mind as you're trying to set up accessibility for your firm for clients, is that not all disabilities are something that you can see. So, you may have a client who is using a wheelchair and needs a ramp to your office. That might be something that you could very obviously see with your eyes, but you may have clients who identify as having disabilities who it's not as obvious to you when they come in, and it can be hugely beneficial to set up some accommodations for those folks as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into this. I also did want to give a disclaimer towards the beginning of this training that I don't have any particular specialty in assessing disabilities. My background is as a lawyer. And so I share this information, just really sharing information that MVLS has gleaned along our process and trying to make our firm more accessible. Not as, kind of a specialist in identifying disabilities myself, but in our process to do this, we, did did some research and also interviewed some various parties, including the Disability Law Center and some different state agencies in Maryland that work with clients with disabilities. And so much of this information about what is a disability and what are best practices for accommodating clients with disabilities come from those who I think are really experts more than MVLS. And so what I'm talking about is, as an organization that did not necessarily have an expertise, how we were able to take that information and implement it ourselves. So going into Maryland's definition, you will see that it is a little bit different and a little bit more in depth, I guess, in terms of what is required to be to qualify as a disability. Again, I don't think we need to worry too much about these definitions for purposes of this discussion. I'm not as the lawyer trying to assess whether someone has a disability or not. I am just trying to provide the clients the best service that I can if they do have a disability. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. ADA, as I mentioned, is a little bit more broad, and Maryland definition is a little bit more specific. That is, the main difference that I wanted to mention between those two. Okay, so one of the things we said right off the start is a disability may not be something that you can necessarily see in one of your clients. So this is an example actually amongst someone who did some research for us. This person shared with me that she herself had ADHD, and she thought this was a really good graphic in terms of how she relates information to people when she's telling a story. So why is this relevant? If you are working with a client, you're trying to do your initial client interview, find out what happened in the case. You may expect that the conversation is going to go somewhat like the graphic at the top of the screen, where you start at the beginning of the story and you go chronologically to the end of the story. But for people with certain types of disabilities, it may not go in that straight chronological timeline like it perhaps would for you as the attorney. And so I think that that's something, understanding and kind of making yourself aware, doing, some research yourself about the aspects of different disabilities that your clients may have and how they manifest can help you understand, that this client is not telling me these seemingly unrelated facts of this story because, they don't care what's important, or they, don't care about my time or something like that. This is how their mind is working in terms of relating to you, what's going on. And just sometimes having that understanding can be really helpful to building trust with your client, and actually to ultimately getting to the part of the information that you as the attorney need to complete your representation. So I'm going to go on to the next. So facts about disability. I was talking about this, alluding to it a bit at the beginning of my presentation. 20% of people in Maryland, adults, have a disability. So when clients walk into your door, again, regardless of their household income level, Some percentage of those clients do have a disability, whether it's something that you can visualize with your eyes or not. So this is important for us in attorneys in providing the best representation we can, and in also attracting people to our law firms that we are providing, that we are catering to clients who have a disability as well as clients who do not. One of the things that I learned in a training that I attended about best practices for working with people with disabilities is that I think sometimes people have this thought of like, we're going to, conduct our practice one way for the 90% of people who come in who don't have a disability, and then we're going to make this special accommodation for the 10% who do. And one of the things that they had brought up in this training, and again, this is not my idea, but some research that had been done by someone else, is this idea of sometimes that accommodation that you might make for that 10% of the people can actually be helpful to all of your clients, even those who do not have a disability. So the example that I heard presented in this training was that when Starbucks decided to implement their mobile ordering app, at that time they had done it to assist clients who had hearing impairments, and over time it obviously became a thing that's utilized and useful to many individuals who frequent their store, whether they have any kind of disability or not. So I guess the point of that is to not make assumptions that whatever kind of accommodation you might need to put in place is going to be burdensome for you or more burdensome for the majority of your clients. It might actually lead to a change that can be really helpful to your whole client base. So some of the things to kind of keep in mind, people with disabilities, they may require more time to speak or process. So again, that kind of leads into thinking about how you're conducting your client interviews and making sure that you are giving that person the time and the space to speak and convey their information to you. People with certain developmental disabilities may react more slowly to requests or commands, might wait for a prompt on what to do or say in certain situations, or might struggle to answer questions or describe details, which again, as an attorney, this can be relevant to these questions, or details may be relevant to their legal case. And so it can be helpful to understand on the front end if your client may be in a situation where it's going to be more difficult for them to answer your questions. So the prevalence of disabilities is the highest statistically for adults with less education and lower household incomes. So, again, that your MVLS clients may have an even higher prevalence of disability than clients in the general population. So as you are working with and supporting our clients, this is especially important to keep in mind, although by no means is it limited to MVLS clients. So there are over 200 common developmental disabilities. And again, this is not a training on, the medical diagnoses of developmental disabilities, but more to just kind of demonstrate that there are quite a few and the disabilities that may not be, again, visible to you, but that your clients might be working through as you are working with them on their legal case. Okay, so how do you ask if someone has a disability? Should you ask if someone has a disability as you're beginning to work with them? Based on the research that we did at MVLS, we determined that it is a best practice to ask on the intake when you're intaking a new client, whether someone needs accommodations. And in fact, if you don't ask something about that, it might the client might assume that you're not able or willing to make any accommodations for them. So rather than, feeling like, oh, I don't want to make this person feel bad if I ask them about their disability, it actually is a best practice to ask about it. And, and in that, at that same time, to share that you are interested in making whatever accommodations they need. So you can ask, do you identify as someone with a disability, or do you have a disability? And as it says on the screen, the next question is always following up to ask whether there's accommodation that will best serve them. So with that in mind, you never want to make an assumption, again, just because a client tells you they have a disability, about what would be the best accommodation to serve them. You want to ask them. Different clients might have different things that work best for them and different preferences. And so again, don't feel like you are being rude or intrusive by asking. That really is the best practice based on the research we did in terms of making sure you're best serving your clients. Okay, so one of the things that can frequently be a challenge with clients, whether or not they have a disability, is communication. I'm sure we've all experienced that. One of the things that you want to make sure you include in your intake process is, what's the client's preferred method of communication? If a client has a low literacy level, for instance, a letter, email, text message even might not be the way that they're best going to understand what you have to convey to them. If someone is hearing impaired, however, maybe actually they would prefer to receive written communications. And there can be a variety of different disabilities. If someone is blind, maybe, again, like, you don't want to make an assumption. You don't want to assume that they're not going to be able to read an email that you send them. They may have a screen reader, and that might be how they prefer to communicate. So that's why you always want to ask what accommodations would be helpful to the client. So that's kind of one tip for your initial client intake. Okay, if you know in advance of the first client meeting that they have a disability, you can do some research on the disability on the front end. There might be some things that would be helpful to the client that are, again, like you'll see on this page, really not expensive, but maybe will make the meeting and the representation go a lot smoother. Setting in time maybe to take a quick break during the meeting, if that would be helpful to the client. Having pen and paper out for the client to take notes. It might be challenging for them to be listening to you and remembering and taking in what you're saying. If they have a physical disability, they may need a certain type of seating. That is definitely a challenge I've seen at MBLS, when we're out and about at like a community clinic at a certain site. Sometimes there's certain chairs that clients have a lot of difficulty getting in and out of. So those are the types of things that are not very expensive to implement, and something that might make a big difference in your client's comfort and understanding of what you're meeting with them about. Okay, during the client meeting, if a client has a sensory disorder, it might be helpful for them to have the room dimmed and not so bright. You want to make sure that you're speaking calmly and that you are not shouting. Likewise, not speaking too fast. I think that's something that's challenging for some lawyers. Speaking calmly and slowly. If there are really key phrases or directions you're giving, you may want to repeat them. Again, this is not a sign of disrespect, but some people learn better by hearing information repetitively. learn the person's name, use your name when speaking. And then sometimes it might be helpful to read written information to the client, and you can ask them, would it be helpful if we read through portions of this representation agreement together, or whatever the case may be? And if they say yes, yes, it might take a little bit more time. It may also save you some time and trouble on the back end if you take the time to make sure the client understands what you're trying to convey at the beginning. And then there's certain things that you can do in the way that you're speaking that can help the client understand, okay, we're going to transition from one action item to the next, or one topic to the next. So using things like the word, like, first we're going to talk about X, then we're going to talk about Y. Again, I think, this is something that might be helpful to a variety of people, but especially for clients with certain types of developmental challenges, this can be very helpful. All right. During the representation, one of the things you want to do is make sure the client is understanding what you are saying to them. One of the ways that you can do this is ask them to kind of repeat back what you just conveyed to them. And this is an example of how you can do that in a respectful way. I think people, again, are sometimes nervous about, I don't want to sound disrespectful by implying they weren't listening to me or something like that. But there are, you can do this in a respectful way, and it is going, again, just showing the client that you care, that they understand, and also getting everyone on the same page to make the representation as smooth going as you can going forward. So the example here, you could say something like, I'm not sure if I explained that very well. Do you mind giving me a sense of what we just talked about so I can see if I need to clarify or re-explain? And then, be patient, give them the time to try to convey that back to you, and you can see whether it is something you need to try to re-explain, or the client did understand what you were sharing. Okay, in terms of follow-up after that first meeting, so it is sometimes very helpful for clients to have an email or a letter, a piece of paper they can take with them that says what the client needs to do next and by when. They may not just, might have been a lot of information to take in, and it might not be easy for them to just remember that. So to have that either can be something they can reference, or, if there's someone else in their life that they're willing to share what's going on in the case, and that person frequently helps them with things like this, that would be useful for that third party as well. Using a numbered list to kind of structure what you're telling them is needed in terms of follow-up can be helpful. Explain what you're going to be doing as well as what you need them to do and when you will follow up. So that is helpful. I think, I guess two different scenarios I can think of. I'm sure we've all had clients, number one, who maybe call us every day, maybe multiple times a day. And, perhaps this is related to some disability or that they may have in terms of that's creating them a lot of anxiety or what have you. Also, legal cases are certainly very stressful to be a part of. So knowing the expectation is in terms of when you will follow up is helpful to them. And then in terms of their list of what they need to do next, I'm sure we've likewise all had the experience where we are frustrated because we asked a client to do something that we needed from them to follow up, and they did not do it. So, again, this is kind of like, don't make the assumption right off the bat that the client doesn't care about their case. They're not invested in their case. There may be something else that is going on in terms of that client having a disability, and there might be strategies like the ones on the screen that we can start using that will make things more successful going forward. I also wanted to say, and I always say this when I'm doing trainings like this, that MVLS is here to provide a support to our volunteer attorneys. So if you are working with an MVLS client and you're experiencing some of these challenges that we're talking about, don't hesitate to reach out to me, reach out to the paralegal who assigned the case to you. We will also be happy to help you in terms of trying to facilitate communication between you and the client, try to figure out what might work best for the client. If a client discloses to us on intake that they do have some sort of disability and there's certain accommodations that would be helpful for them, we will convey that information to you. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable. You haven't built that trust yet, and they're not going to tell you that right at the beginning. And so you may run into challenges or get new information that we didn't have, and we're happy to help you work through that as well. So the last pointer on this slide is sending a reminder email a few days before the next appointment, reminding the client about what they need to do or bring on that checklist. Okay, just a couple of other things to keep in mind as you're working with this client through the representation. If you are using a translator, if the client uses a translator, we actually have a whole nother training on working with a translator, working with an interpreter. So please feel free to take that training if it's something that you want to get more information on. But you always want to speak to the person who is your client, not to the interpreter. You're having the conversation with the client. The interpreter will listen to you and they will translate what you're saying. But you want to make sure you're addressing that individual so that, you know, you're looking at them, you're facing them. That is a best practice for using an interpreter. If a client is in a wheelchair, you never want to push that wheelchair, move it without their permission. You always want to ask them. That is a best practice and something that is would be considered rude. You don't want to portray the client in a way that will further stereotypes about their disability. So, you know, you don't want to like play up that this client was, you know, a victim because of their disability. So you do want to definitely talk to the client about your strategy in terms of your how you're portraying the case, and certainly think yourself about whether there's anything that could be offensive or you know, that you want to discuss with your client before moving forward. And talk to the client about they're going to need accommodations in court and request those accommodations if needed. So your client with a disability might be very nervous about going into court because they don't know if the court is going to accommodate them or not. So that is something that you know, you want to have a discussion with them about before you go into court. Okay, so the next section we're going to move into is some recommendations for client documents. So one is using plain language. I think this is something, you know, hopefully most of us are taught somewhat about in law school as we're transitioning into the legal world, but you do want to avoid in your client letters using a lot of legalese and language that the client will not understand. The average American reading level is an 8th grade reading level. The average reading level for MBLS's clients is a bit lower than that. So you want to make sure that you are speaking and writing in a way that the client can understand and can engage with their case. There are some resources on the internet. There's one that's listed here, the Readability Analyzer, that can actually read your letters for you and tell you, you know, what reading level you're writing in if you want to run any of your information by them and make sure that you are writing in a way that your clients are going to be able to understand. How do you write in plain language? It's one thing to just say write in plain language, but it's helpful to have some concrete suggestions for how to do so. So, you know, one of the big ones is knowing your audience, thinking about what the audience would understand. Write more similarly to how you speak than to, you know, maybe how you know, how you would write when you're submitting something to the court. Make sure you're being as concrete as possible and you're not using too much jargon. If you do need to use jargon, do it in a purposeful manner. For instance, you may need to use a legal term because it's going to be important for that client to understand what that legal term means as the case progresses. But, you know, make sure that you are not putting in too much jargon unnecessarily and that you're explaining what you mean when you do use legal jargon. Trying to be as concise as possible. You definitely want to avoid very long sentences, run-on sentences. Try to make sure that your writing is going in a logical flow from point A to point B. If there's any context that, you know, needs to be, it's helpful to explain, kind of weaving in some of the facts can be helpful. So these are some pointers about writing in plain language that your clients will understand. This is something, actually, I had two interns help me with some of this research over the summer as we were implementing these things at MVLS. And one of the things they showed me that I had never actually been exposed to before was this thing called Bionic Font, which is what you see on your screen. It is pretty cool. It's something that makes, you know, helps people with different types of reading related disabilities be able to read things easier and faster. And so, you know, this is something you can use, but also just kind of an example of there may be a lot of things that you can find through doing research that you weren't not even aware of that can make things easier for your clients with disabilities. So some really concrete recommendations: add a question into your intake process for clients about their preferred method of communication. Make sure all office documents that you use are accessible for screen readers, and that's something that clients who have visual impairments might use. Check your client materials for plain language and readability. Again, you can use that website that was referenced earlier on if you would like to do so. And just, I think maybe most important, when you're meeting with a client, emphasize your commitment to you know, making your service accessible to them and invite them to make accommodation requests. It's one of those things where, you know, if you don't ask, you're not going to know oftentimes, and you're not going to learn what you could be doing to make your services better for your clients. There is an accessibility checker in Outlook, which I also never knew about before we started doing this research, and you might not either. This is just a example of what it looks like. This is just kind of on a blank email that was created by one of my colleagues to see, you know, what it looks like. And it is showing that there was certain text in this email that was hard to read because of the way the fonts were set up. It's showing that there was a picture in the email that was missing alternative text, which is when you're, and this might be not something that some of you have to handle on a day-to-day basis, but when you're putting pictures on the internet, there's a way that you can set up something called alternative text. And if someone is looking at that with a screen reader rather than seeing the picture, they're going to hear, you know, for instance, this is a picture of a hurricane or whatever it's a picture of. And so that's what alternative text does. And that's something you want to think about for your websites, which is not what I'm not going to delve into that in this particular training, but just to kind of explain what this accessibility checker is finding were the issues with this particular email. There are a couple simple things you can do to make your documents more accessible, and there is a resource that I'm going to post with this training from the National Center for Law and Elder Rights. But using headings, using auto numbering and bulleting, alternative text, I just explained that, colors that contrast sharply, and then using the accessibility checkers in common programs like Word. So I just showed you the one in Outlook, but there's also one in Word if you're writing Word documents. And I think a lot of people just don't even use them. And this could give you some really helpful information about whether the document you're working on is accessible. And as you could see, it actually told us, what we would need to change to make it more accessible. There are specific resources that we found for deaf clients, which I wanted to highlight through the state of Maryland. There are some resources. There is also a lot of online platforms. I think, one of the benefits of moving towards a more virtual workplace in recent years is that there are some things that make it easier for people with disabilities. There's some that make it harder, but for instance, with Zoom, there's something you can use called live transcription. So as I'm speaking, it would translate what I'm saying into words across the bottom of the screen. Like if you have closed captioning on your TV, this can be really helpful to someone with a hearing impairment. And there are other resources that are available through the state of Maryland as well. So those are helpful to know if you are working with a deaf client. So I wanted to talk about, how we went about doing some of this research and making some changes in our office and some of the physical changes that we made. So at MVLS, one of the first things we did was we formed an accessibility committee. This committee was comprised of different staff members from across our organization who had different roles, who might be able to give us some input into things like the client intake process, the reception area, the process from the point of view of an attorney. So we formed this committee and we started meeting regularly and doing some research. And as I said, interviewing some people who had some more experience with these issues. And some of the things that we did was we implemented something into our onboarding process for new staff where we just simply ask, do you have need an accommodation that we should be aware of? We always had something in our personnel policies stating that, we have a policy where you can request an accommodation and, we had a procedure, but it was not in our onboarding procedures specifically to call this out as something of note for someone to think about as they're onboarding. Since we have put that into place, we have had more people than we used to fill out that section of our onboarding and share with us that they do need some kind of accommodation. So that can make a difference. We ordered Braille signs for outside the front door to our office. This, again, was not a super expensive thing that we did, but for someone who is visually impaired, when they come up to our office, formerly they may have had no idea where the doorbell was or what to do if it was after hours and they needed to call, or like all that information was kind of posted on pieces of paper. So ordering these Braille signs was a relatively inexpensive thing that we were able to do that can make a big difference. Adding image descriptions on our social media and website, I spoke about that a little bit. And then we ordered an evacuation chair in case of an emergency. We realized that we were not super comfortable with what our building had in place for a person who might be in a wheelchair in the event of an emergency like a fire, and we are on the 14th floor. So that was something that we have also done at MVLS. I have included a lot of different helpful resources here that our committee referenced as we were doing this research. And with that is the end of my presentation today. So I will ask if there are any questions. And I don't think I see any. So I want to thank you all for being with me today. Please check out our website, mvlslaw.org. There you can see our pro bono portal. We have available cases posted. We also have a lot of other trainings on substantive legal topics as well as practical topics like this that I would invite you to check out. And thank you again for being an MVLS volunteer. We appreciate your support. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.